Oh, look, this kid's got some stuff. He's gone from a traffic stop to a felony.
Hutchins, the whole thing was videotaped and sent to federal investigators.
Racist cop plants drugs on the wrong black Marine veteran. He just made the single worst mistake of his life. The patrol car's dashboard camera flickered off at exactly 2:47 a.m. as Officer Bradley Hutchins approached the black Tahoe on Arizona's Highway 89. His sweaty palm already clutching the baggie of cocaine he'd used to destroy dozens of innocent lives. What this racist cop didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Marcus Reaper Williams had been recording every second through military-grade surveillance equipment hidden throughout his vehicle, building the federal case that would obliterate Hutchins' corrupt empire. Marcus sat motionless behind the wheel, combat-trained hands visible at 10 and 2, watching Hutchins swagger forward with the arrogance of a predator who'd never faced real consequences. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught Marcus to recognize enemy movement patterns, and tonight he was watching a domestic terrorist in uniform prepare to commit another felony under color of law. What happened next would prove that some battles follow warriors home from foreign shores, and the most dangerous enemies sometimes hide behind American badges. The desert town of Copper Ridge squatted along Highway 89 like a bureaucratic vulture, feeding on the misery of travelers who made the fatal mistake of driving through its jurisdiction while black or Hispanic. Officer Bradley Hutchins had transformed this stretch of Arizona asphalt into his personal ATM, systematically targeting minority motorists for fabricated traffic violations that ended with planted evidence and seized vehicles. At 38, Hutchins embodied every toxic stereotype of small-town law enforcement, racist, power-hungry, and protected by a system that valued loyalty over justice. His corruption scheme was elegant in its brutality. Identify vulnerable targets, plant drugs during routine searches, then split the federal asset forfeiture bonuses with his partners while building arrest statistics that earned commendations from supervisors who never questioned his methods. The mathematics of evil were simple. Over 5 years, Hutchins had destroyed 47 lives, stolen $2.3 million in vehicles and property, and built a reputation as Copper Ridge's most productive officer. His victims were chosen with predatory precision, travelers without local connections, people whose word would never match a sworn police officer's testimony, families too poor to hire attorneys who might challenge his lies. Marcus Williams represented everything Hutchins feared about changing America. At 35, the retired Marine carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd earned his respect through blood and sacrifice rather than inherited privilege and institutional protection. 3 tours in Afghanistan with force reconnaissance had forged him into one of America's most elite warriors before an IED blast ended his active duty and redirected his mission toward domestic service. The transition from military combat to civilian justice hadn't diminished Marcus's warrior instincts. It had refined them for a different battlefield. His law degree from Georgetown University had provided legal weapons, while his position with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office had given him federal authority to hunt the kind of domestic enemies he'd once fought overseas. For 6 months, Marcus had been building the case that would destroy Hutchins's criminal organization. His investigation had identified the corrupt cop as the primary actor in a racketeering scheme that involved 12 officers across 3 counties generating millions in illegal revenue while destroying innocent lives with industrial efficiency. The black Tahoe Marcus drove was actually a mobile command center disguised as a civilian vehicle. Hidden cameras captured multiple angles, encrypted communications, transmitted real-time data to federal servers, and GPS tracking provided precise location data that would support prosecution. His military-grade scanner intercepted police radio traffic, revealing coordination between corrupt officers that proved conspiracy rather than isolated incidents. Tonight's operation would test every skill Marcus had learned in 2 decades of serving his country. His mission wasn't just stopping one racist cop. It was exposing a system that enabled predators to hide behind badges while preying on vulnerable Americans for profit and pleasure. The stakes were enormous for both men. Hutchins was about to commit federal crimes that would end his career and freedom, while Marcus was risking his life to prove that some oaths, like the one he'd sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, didn't expire when the uniform came off. The confrontation building on this desert highway would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether one warrior's dedication could overcome an institution's indifference, and whether America's promise of equal protection under law was worth the blood its defenders had shed to preserve it. The traffic stop began with theatrical precision that Marcus recognized from his intelligence briefings. Hutchins activated his emergency lights at the exact moment his radio crackled with coordinated communications that Marcus's scanner captured in crystal clarity. The backup unit fell into position while a third patrol car blocked potential escape routes, tactical coordination that proved this was planned persecution rather than random enforcement. "License and registration," Hutchins barked as he approached the driver's window, his tone designed to establish dominance through intimidation. "Step out of the vehicle. This is a routine traffic stop for suspected DUI." Marcus complied with military precision, his movements deliberate and controlled. 2 decades of Marine discipline had taught him that survival often depended on following orders while gathering intelligence, and his current intelligence suggested this traffic stop was anything but routine. His hidden cameras were recording everything, while encrypted transmissions sent real-time updates to federal prosecutors waiting in Phoenix. "Sir, I haven't been drinking," Marcus replied respectfully, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers under fire. "May I ask what specific traffic violation prompted this stop?" Hutchins's response was both predictable and legally devastating. "Don't get smart with me, boy. I smell alcohol on your breath, and you were weaving all over the road. Turn around and put your hands on the hood." The racial slur was delivered with casual confidence that suggested this wasn't Hutchins' first attempt to humiliate a black motorist into submission. But every word was being recorded by equipment that would make his denials impossible in federal court. Marcus assumed the search position while his peripheral vision tracked Hutchins' movements with combat awareness that had kept him alive through countless firefights. The moment he'd been waiting for arrived when Hutchins palmed the plastic baggie with practiced ease, preparing to plant evidence that would transform a bogus traffic stop into a felony arrest. The technique was smooth and rehearsed, suggesting this corrupt cop had destroyed other lives with identical methods. Hutchins's hand moved toward Marcus's jacket pocket with the confidence of someone who'd never been caught, never been challenged, never faced consequences for his crimes. But Marcus had been preparing for this moment longer than Hutchins had been perfecting his technique. Every aspect of tonight's encounter had been orchestrated to create the perfect federal case, unassailable evidence, multiple witnesses, and documentation that would survive any defense strategy. The psychological pressure was enormous. Marcus's military training warred with his legal education as he forced himself to remain passive while watching a crime unfold in real time. His combat instincts screamed to neutralize the threat, while his prosecutorial mind demanded patience to ensure admissible evidence. "Well, what do we have here?" Hutchins announced loudly, his voice carrying false surprise that wouldn't fool a child. "Looks like our boy here was carrying some illegal substances. Guess this routine traffic stop just became a felony arrest." The performance was flawless. Except for one critical error, Hutchins had chosen a target who'd been recording everything, analyzing his methods, and building a federal case that would send him to prison for decades. Marcus watched the show with the detached analysis of someone who'd studied enemy propaganda operations in war zones. Every movement was calculated, every word chosen to create a narrative that would justify whatever punishment Hutchins had planned. But the corrupt cop had walked into a trap so sophisticated he couldn't even see the bars closing around him. The moment of truth arrived when Marcus decided to reveal his hand, transforming from victim to prosecutor in words that would haunt Hutchins for the rest of his life. "Officer Hutchins, I need to inform you that this interaction is being recorded through multiple devices, including military-grade equipment that's been transmitting to federal investigators since you began following me 20 miles ago." The color drained from Hutchins's face like water from a broken dam, as Marcus's words penetrated his arrogance and reached the primitive survival instincts that even corrupt cops retained. The easy score he'd anticipated was revealed as an elaborate federal sting operation that had caught him red-handed, committing multiple felonies while wearing a badge. "I also need to inform you," Marcus continued with clinical precision, "that I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps, retired. I hold a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University Law Center, and I'm currently employed as a civilian contractor for the Department of Defense Inspector General's Office, investigating police corruption in agencies receiving federal funding." Each revelation hit Hutchins like artillery fire, transforming his predatory confidence into desperate panic. The quiet black man he'd targeted for destruction was actually a federal investigator with the authority and expertise to end his career, his freedom, and his life as he knew it. Marcus wasn't finished dismantling Hutchins's world. "The baggie you just planted contains a tracking device I placed there this morning, along with a substance that will fluoresce under UV light to prove it came from your evidence locker. Your radio communications coordinating this fake traffic stop have been intercepted and recorded. Your financial records showing regular deposits that correlate with asset seizures have been audited by federal accountants." The corrupt cop's breakdown was visible and complete. His hands trembled as he processed the mathematical certainty of his doom, while his backup officers realized they'd been pulled into a federal case that would destroy everyone involved. "This is entrapment." Hutchins screamed, his desperation transforming into rage as he grasped for any defense that might save him. "You set me up. This whole thing was a trap." Marcus's response was delivered with the patience of someone who'd interrogated actual terrorists. Officer Hutchins' entrapment requires law enforcement officers to induce criminal behavior that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. You've been planting drugs on innocent drivers for 5 years. I simply provided you with another opportunity to commit the same crimes you've been committing regularly. The legal distinction was crucial and devastating. Marcus hadn't created Hutchins' criminal behavior, he'd merely documented it with precision that would make successful prosecution inevitable. The situation escalated when Special Agent Sarah Chen emerged from concealment positions Marcus had identified during his reconnaissance. Federal agents surrounded the scene with tactical efficiency that made Hutchins's earlier coordination look amateur by comparison. Officer Bradley Hutchins, Agent Chen announced with bureaucratic authority, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, money laundering, racketeering, and approximately 12 other federal charges that are going to put you away for 25 years minimum." Hutchins's partner, Officer Janet Mills, faced the choice between loyalty to a corrupt colleague and self-preservation. Her decision was swift and comprehensive. She began cooperating with federal investigators, immediately providing evidence about Hutchins' methods, his victims, and the broader corruption scheme that had operated within their department for years. The institutional implications were staggering. Copper Ridge Police Department faced federal oversight, massive civil lawsuits, and the kind of scrutiny that would either force comprehensive reform or complete dissolution. Chief Rodriguez, who'd enabled Hutchins' crimes through willful blindness, submitted his resignation before federal charges could be filed. Marcus's role in the investigation was both personal and professional. His military service had instilled values, honor, integrity service that made police corruption particularly offensive. His legal training had provided tools to fight systematic injustice through evidence and prosecution rather than vigilante violence. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Cell phone videos from bystanders captured federal agents arresting the corrupt cop, while Marcus's military credentials and federal authority made him a compelling symbol of justice served. The story went viral within hours, inspiring other victims of police corruption to come forward while encouraging qualified minorities to pursue careers in law enforcement. But the most dangerous escalation was yet to come. Hutchins's corruption network included connections throughout Arizona law enforcement political figures who'd benefited from his illegal activities and media allies who would attempt to destroy Marcus's credibility through character assassination and institutional protection. The battle was expanding beyond one corrupt cop to encompass an entire system of institutional racism and legalized theft disguised as law enforcement. Marcus had triggered a war between federal oversight and local corruption, between constitutional rights and police privilege, between justice and the profitable status quo that protected predators while destroying their prey. The investigation would reveal dozens of additional victims, millions in stolen assets, and connections to organized crime that had used corrupt police as enforcement tools for drug trafficking and money laundering operations. What had begun as one Marine's quest for justice would become a federal racketeering case that would reshape law enforcement throughout the Southwest. Marcus's personal transformation during this period was equally significant. The quiet investigation had forced him to confront his own experiences with racism, his struggles with PTSD, and his determination to ensure that his military service continued serving his country even after the uniform came off. The battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than one man's justice. They encompassed the fundamental question of whether America's promise of equal protection under law was worth the blood its defenders had shed to preserve it. The counterattack came from directions Marcus hadn't anticipated, launched by enemies whose existence proved the corruption ran deeper than one racist cop's personal prejudices. Within 48 hours of Hutchins's arrest, a coordinated campaign began to destroy Marcus's credibility, his career, and his life through the same institutional machinery that had protected corrupt officers for decades. Detective Ray Morrison, Hutchins's former partner and current head of internal affairs, orchestrated the assault with military precision that revealed law enforcement training turned toward protecting criminals instead of catching them. Morrison's strategy was elegant in its brutality. Paint Marcus as an unstable veteran seeking revenge against police, question the legality of his investigation, and create enough reasonable doubt to force federal prosecutors into plea bargains that would minimize punishment. The first blow came when Morrison leaked Marcus's sealed military medical records to sympathetic media outlets, revealing his PTSD diagnosis and the circumstances of his medical discharge. Local news stations began broadcasting stories about an emotionally unstable veteran who'd used illegal surveillance techniques to frame dedicated police officers trying to serve their community. Staff Sergeant Williams clearly suffers from combat-related mental health issues that have affected his judgment, Morrison told reporters with practiced concern. His obsession with local law enforcement suggests someone who's projecting his own trauma onto innocent officers doing difficult jobs under challenging circumstances. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and devastating. Marcus found himself defending his sanity instead of prosecuting Hutchins's crimes, while media coverage focused on his military injuries rather than the evidence of systematic police corruption. The narrative was shifting from criminal cop caught in the act to troubled veteran targeting law enforcement. The attacks escalated when anonymous sources began suggesting that Marcus had fabricated evidence, violated federal surveillance laws, and exceeded his authority as a civilian contractor. Social media campaigns portrayed him as a rogue federal agent who'd entrapped honest police officers through illegal sting operations that violated constitutional protections. Agent Chen's position became precarious as political pressure mounted from congressional representatives, police unions, and media figures demanding accountability for the botched investigation. Her supervisors began questioning whether the operation had been properly authorized, whether evidence collection had followed protocol, and whether federal resources had been appropriately deployed against local law enforcement. Marcus Chen warned during a tense meeting in Phoenix, "We're getting serious pushback from Washington. Some people are suggesting we should focus on getting Hutchins dismissed from the force rather than pursuing federal charges. The political cost of this prosecution might exceed its benefits." The suggestion was both pragmatic and devastating. Allowing Hutchins to escape federal prosecution would send a message that police corruption carried minimal consequences while undermining the broader investigation into systematic abuse. But fighting through federal court would require resources, political capital, and evidence that might not survive the kind of scrutiny that high-profile prosecutions attracted. Marcus's darkest moment came when 3 of Hutchins's previous victims recanted their statements, claiming they'd been coerced by federal agents into making false accusations against an innocent police officer. The retractions were clearly coordinated and probably purchased, but they created enough reasonable doubt to complicate prosecution while generating sympathetic media coverage for the falsely accused cop. The psychological pressure was enormous. Marcus found himself reliving combat experiences, struggling with insomnia and anxiety that he'd managed successfully for years. The PTSD that Morrison had weaponized against him was actually being triggered by the institutional betrayal he was experiencing from the system he'd sworn to serve. But the crisis also revealed Marcus's true character and the depths of his commitment to justice. Instead of retreating into isolation or accepting defeat, he chose to fight back with the same determination that had carried him through 3 combat tours and law school. His response was both personal and strategic. Marcus recorded a video statement that acknowledged his PTSD while explaining how military service had prepared him to fight corruption wherever he found it. He detailed the evidence against Hutchins, challenged his accusers to address the facts rather than attacking his mental health, and called for transparency in the investigation process. "Yes, I have PTSD from serving my country in Afghanistan," Marcus said directly to the camera. "Those experiences taught me to recognize enemies of American values, whether they carry AK-47s in Kandahar or badges in Copper Ridge. The evidence against Officer Hutchins is overwhelming and documented. Anyone questioning my credibility is invited to examine the recordings, the financial records, and the testimony of his victims." The video went viral within hours, shifting public opinion and demonstrating that Marcus possessed the communication skills and moral authority to fight institutional corruption on multiple fronts. The battle was far from over, but the warrior who'd survived enemy fire abroad was proving equally resilient against domestic enemies, hiding behind badges and bureaucracy. The federal courthouse in Phoenix had become a theater of war, where 2 competing visions of American justice would collide with consequences extending far beyond one corrupt cop's fate. United States versus Bradley Hutchins represented more than criminal prosecution. It was a referendum on whether institutional corruption could survive exposure to federal oversight and constitutional accountability. Marcus Williams entered the courthouse through a gauntlet of protesters, media crews, and federal security that reflected the case's national significance. Death threats from police supporters mixed with encouragement from civil rights advocates, creating an atmosphere of tension that reminded him of entering hostile territory in Afghanistan. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by federal prosecutor Janet Rodriguez, with surgical precision that left no doubt about the government's confidence in their evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next 2 weeks, you will see overwhelming proof that the defendant systematically violated the constitutional rights of innocent Americans while hiding behind the authority of his badge. Defense attorney Michael Chen's response attempted every possible strategy: selective prosecution, entrapment, prosecutorial misconduct. But his arguments collapsed when confronted with the sheer volume of evidence Marcus's investigation had produced. Body camera footage, financial records, victim testimony, and physical evidence created an impenetrable wall of proof that made Hutchins's guilt mathematically certain. The trial's first complication came when the defense produced Dr. Patricia Hayes, a forensic psychologist, who testified that Marcus's PTSD made him an unreliable witness whose perceptions might be distorted by combat-related trauma. The attack was sophisticated and personally devastating, forcing Marcus to defend his mental health while prosecuting Hutchins's crimes. Marcus's response was both courageous and strategically brilliant. Taking the stand despite the risks of cross-examination, he described his military service, his legal training, and his methodical approach to the investigation. When defense attorneys attempted to portray his PTSD as a credibility issue, Marcus turned the tables with quiet authority. "My PTSD comes from watching good Marines die, protecting American values." Marcus testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "Those experiences taught me to recognize enemies of democracy, whether they carry weapons in foreign countries or badges in American towns. The evidence speaks for itself. I'm just the messenger." The second complication emerged when Detective Morrison was called as a character witness, for Hutchins prepared to testify about his former partner's dedication to law enforcement. But federal prosecutors were ready with devastating counter-evidence recordings of Morrison coaching Hutchins on evidence-planting techniques, financial records showing Morrison's participation in the asset forfeiture scheme, and testimony from victims who'd been intimidated by both officers. Morrison's arrest in the courtroom was unprecedented and spectacular, with federal marshals taking him into custody on conspiracy charges while the jury watched in stunned silence. The moment transformed the defense strategy from challenging Marcus's credibility to damage control that became impossible as more co-conspirators were implicated. The trial's climax came during victim impact testimony that revealed the human cost of Hutchins's crimes. Maria Santos, whose car had been seized after planted cocaine destroyed her family, spoke with quiet dignity that made several jurors weep. "I trusted police officers because I thought they were supposed to protect people like me. Instead, Officer Hutchins stole my children's future so he could buy a bigger house." 12 additional victims testified about lost jobs, broken families, and psychological trauma inflicted by a man who'd sworn to serve and protect. The parade of suffering was overwhelming and damning, proving that Hutchins's corruption had destroyed lives across racial, economic, and social boundaries. The defense's final gambit was a desperate attempt to portray Hutchins as a scapegoat for broader institutional problems. "My client made mistakes," Chen argued, "but he's being prosecuted for systemic issues that extend far beyond one officer's actions." Federal prosecutor Rodriguez's closing argument dismantled this excuse with prosecutorial precision. The defendant didn't make mistakes, he made choices. He chose to target innocent Americans based on their race. He chose to plant evidence to justify illegal seizures. He chose to profit from human suffering while hiding behind his badge. Ladies and gentlemen, those choices have consequences. Jury deliberation lasted 53 minutes, barely enough time to elect a foreman and complete the paperwork. When they returned, the verdict was comprehensive and devastating guilty on all 15 federal charges, with sentences that would ensure Hutchins never wore a badge again. Judge Patricia Williams, a former federal prosecutor with 2 decades of experience, delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of Hutchins' crimes and the broader message federal courts needed to send. "Mr. Hutchins, you have perverted the law, betrayed your oath, and destroyed innocent lives for personal profit. Your crimes represent not just individual corruption, but institutional failure that demands meaningful accountability. 27 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Complete forfeiture of all assets acquired through criminal activity. Permanent disbarment from law enforcement employment. The sentence exceeded even Marcus's expectations, representing the kind of accountability that would deter other corrupt officers while providing justice for Hutchins's victims. The institutional consequences were equally comprehensive. Copper Ridge Police Department was dissolved and replaced with county law enforcement under federal oversight. The asset forfeiture program was suspended pending investigation, while new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar corruption schemes. Detective Morrison received 15 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy, while 4 other officers were indicted on charges ranging from civil rights violations to money laundering. The investigation that had begun with one corrupt traffic stop had exposed an entire network of criminal law enforcement that had operated with impunity for years. The media response to Hutchins's conviction was overwhelmingly positive, with editorial boards praising federal intervention in local corruption while acknowledging the necessity of outside oversight when institutional systems failed. Marcus became a national symbol of military veterans using their skills to serve civilian communities, inspiring recruitment campaigns that targeted qualified minorities for law enforcement careers. But the most meaningful response came from Hutchins's victims, who found validation and closure through the federal prosecution. Support groups formed among people who'd been falsely arrested, creating networks that helped members rebuild their lives while advocating for others facing similar injustices. As Marcus reflected on the operation's success from his promoted position within the Inspector General's office, he thought about the lesson Hutchins had learned too late in America. Oaths of service create obligations that extend beyond uniforms and paychecks. Some people earn respect through sacrifice and dedication, while others lose it through corruption and betrayal. The corrupt cop had seen a black man and assumed vulnerability. What he'd actually encountered was a Marine who'd made protecting constitutional rights his personal mission, backed by federal authority and supported by evidence that made successful prosecution inevitable. Justice Marcus understood required patience, preparation, and the kind of strategic thinking that came from military training combined with legal education. But when justice finally arrived, it was comprehensive enough to honor every oath he'd sworn and every principle he'd fought to defend. The Hutchins prosecution created ripple effects throughout American law enforcement that transformed how federal agencies approached police corruption investigations. The case established legal precedent for using military veterans as undercover investigators while demonstrating that systematic documentation could overcome institutional protection of corrupt officers. Within 2 years, 17 additional departments faced federal investigation using methodologies developed during Marcus's operation. The immediate consequences reshaped policing practices across Arizona and neighboring states. Body camera requirements became universal, and tamper-proof asset forfeiture procedures were reformed to prevent abuse, and federal oversight expanded to include regular audits of departments with suspicious statistical patterns. The Williams Protocol, as it became known, represented the most comprehensive police accountability system implemented since the Civil Rights era. Marcus's approach to corruption investigation became a national model that influenced law enforcement agencies from coast to coast. His combination of military training, legal education, and federal authority created a new profession that attracted veterans seeking meaningful civilian service. The pipeline from military combat roles to civilian justice positions became an established career path that helped address both veteran unemployment and police corruption simultaneously. The economic impact was equally significant and far-reaching. Hutchins's conviction triggered a cascade of civil lawsuits that cost Arizona taxpayers over $23 million in settlements, while insurance companies began requiring corruption prevention programs as conditions for coverage. The financial incentives aligned with moral imperatives to create market-driven reforms that exceeded anything government regulation had achieved independently. Educational institutions responded by developing specialized programs that prepared military veterans for civilian law enforcement oversight roles. The curriculum combined military leadership experience with constitutional law investigation techniques and community relations training that produced graduates uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between military and civilian justice systems. The broader cultural impact extended beyond law enforcement to influence national conversations about military service, racial justice, and institutional accountability. Marcus's story became a powerful counter-narrative to stereotypes about unstable veterans, while demonstrating that military training could serve civilian communities when properly channeled through legitimate institutions. International attention followed domestic recognition, with foreign law enforcement agencies studying American reforms that had successfully addressed systematic police corruption. Marcus testified before United Nations committees on criminal justice, sharing techniques that were adapted for use in countries struggling with similar institutional problems. The personal legacy was equally meaningful and lasting. Marcus's marriage to Agent Chen produced 3 children who grew up understanding that service could take many forms beyond military combat. His foundation provided scholarships for minority veterans pursuing law enforcement careers, while creating networks that supported others following similar paths from military service to civilian justice. The universal message resonated across all communities and cultures. Corruption cannot survive sustained exposure to evidence and accountability. Individual courage can catalyze institutional transformation when supported by proper preparation, and some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost or institutional resistance. Marcus Williams had proven that military oaths to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, didn't expire when uniforms came off, and that the most important victories were often won in courtrooms rather than battlefields, protecting fellow Americans from the predators hiding among their supposed protectors.